know what a Jesus rant looks and sounds like, if you get your Bible later, not now, and turn to Matthew chapter 23, it is a rant. I mean, Jesus had no respect for the temple leaders. Jesus had no respect because of the corruption that had happened inside the temple system by the time he showed up in history. I mean, he was all about criticizing it. And in Matthew 23, it just goes on and on and on. And at the end of this rant against these religious leaders, including Caiaphas, the high priest, here's what he says. This kind of caps it all off. He says, "You snakes, you brood of," this is Jesus talking. I mean, you wouldn't let your kids talk like this, okay? "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" In other words, he says to the religious leaders, the people that get up every day and try to be good, the people who are responsible for leading the people who, oversee the sacrificing of animals so that they can find atonement for their sin. He looks at, quote, the best people in the city and he says, "You are going to hell." So it's no wonder that Caiaphas had a little problem with Jesus, his authority, the crowds, and his criticism of everybody that Caiaphas worked with and potentially had respect for. That Jesus threatened the peace, and Jesus personally threatened the peacekeepers. Now, this builds and builds and builds throughout the Gospels. You got to read it. And finally, there's a final straw. And the final straw between Jesus and Caiaphas and the final straw between Jesus and the temple leaders was not something that Jesus said. It was something that Jesus did. It was not a conversation. It was not a confrontation. It was an act of compassion. Jesus raised someone from the dead. And not just anyone. He raised a very famous citizen of Bethany, the city of Bethany. He raised who from the dead? That's right, Lazarus. This was the final straw. What was the pinnacle of his miracles? What was the most amazing thing possible? Because not only had Lazarus died, Lazarus had been what? Buried. That's right. These people in Bethany had been to the funeral, and the next thing you know, they're seeing Lazarus walking around. So this was like over the top, and I mean, the crowd just swelled and swelled and swelled. And they realized, the religious leaders, and Caiaphas in particular, realized that their strategy was failing. And their strategy up to that time was to try to discredit Jesus publicly. That's why when you read the Gospels, they're constantly asking Jesus all these trick questions. And every time they think they've got him, Jesus comes back with a snappy answer, and they look stupid, and the people are like, "Go, Jesus," And so because what they were trying to do, the point of those questions was to try to divide Jesus from the crowd. They wanted Jesus to lose the crowd, because once Jesus loses the crowd, he is no longer a threat to the peace that they had established with Rome. So, for example, after Lazarus had been raised from the dead, here's what John, who saw all of this, was an eyewitness of all of this. Here's what John writes. He says this in John chapter 12. "Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word." So this crowd of people that knew about this miracle, they're telling everybody in the vicinity. So many people, continues, many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So now you got a crowd and a bigger crowd and even a bigger crowd. And the Pharisees and the leaders of the temple are just throwing their hands up and they're thinking, wow, where is this going? How is this ever going to end? So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere." And this was their strategy to try to discredit Jesus with the people by asking him all these tricky questions. It's getting us nowhere. Look how, and I love this. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Now, you need to know this. This is way, fast forward way ahead. In the book of Acts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the book of Acts that tells us what happened in the church after Jesus was raised from the dead, the book of Acts tells us, Luke, who investigated all these things, Luke tells us that many, many priests and Pharisees later became followers of Jesus. That's how John has the inside track to all this information. Later on, when John is investigating and Luke's investigating, some of these priests that eventually followed Jesus and some of these Pharisees that eventually became followers of Jesus said, "John, you can't believe this meeting. We were so frustrated no matter what we did, no matter what we said, no matter what we came up with. Jesus made us look like fools over and over and over." And so John writes this in his gospel. Then we said at one point in one of those meetings, look, the whole world has gone after him, and surely they laughed out loud. Because little did they know, 2,000 years later, come on, a third. I mean, if they think their whole world went after Jesus in Judea, today a third of the world's population declares that Jesus is somebody special. A third of the world's population almost declares that Jesus is Lord. They had no idea.